danger that surrounded them both. Grace pulled her sleeves down to cover the purple fingerprints on her wrists, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. At 30 years old, she should have been glowing with maternal joy, but instead she felt like a shadow of her former self. The successful marketing executive who had once commanded boardrooms had been slowly erased, replaced by this frightened woman who jumped at her own reflection. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm concerned about these bruises," Dr. Whitman said gently, her experienced eyes taking in details that Grace had tried so hard to hide. The 52-year-old obstetrician had delivered hundreds of babies, but she had also learned to read the signs that new mothers sometimes carried invisible wounds alongside their growing children. Grace's throat tightened. The finger-shaped marks around her neck had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but Dr. Whitman's expression changed when she noticed them during the routine examination. "I keep bumping into things," Grace whispered, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "Pregnancy makes me so clumsy." The explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears. She had used variations of it so many times over the past months that the words felt worn smooth, like stones tumbled by endless waves of deception. But Dr. Whitman's steady gaze suggested she wasn't buying the story anymore, then Grace was selling it. "Grace," Dr. Whitman said softly, setting down her clipboard and pulling up a chair. "How are things at home? Really?" Before Grace could formulate another lie, the examination room door burst open with enough force to rattle the medical equipment on the walls. Richard Montgomery filled the doorway, his 6-foot frame imposing in his perfectly tailored suit, his presence immediately changing the entire atmosphere of the room. "What's taking so long?" Richard demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. "I have a conference call in 20 minutes. This is supposed to be a routine appointment." At 38, Richard Montgomery commanded respect in every room he entered. His real estate development company had made him one of the city's wealthiest men, and he wore his success like armor. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his expensive watch caught the fluorescent light, and his cold blue eyes swept the room as if cataloging everything for future use. Grace flinched involuntarily, her body reacting to his tone before her mind could catch up. She had learned to read the subtle changes in his voice, the way it could shift from charming to dangerous in the space of a heartbeat. Today, she could hear the edge that meant trouble. "Mr. Montgomery," Dr. Whitman said, standing to face him with professional composure, "I was just discussing Mrs. Montgomery's health with her. Perhaps you could wait in the lobby while we finish our conversation." Iwana Richards' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Grace had learned to fear. "My wife is carrying my child. I have every right to know what you're discussing." The possessive language wasn't lost on Dr. Whitman, who had heard similar phrasing from other controlling partners over the years. She maintained her calm demeanor, but Grace could see the doctor's evaluation shifting, pieces of a troubling puzzle beginning to fall into place. "Of course," Dr. Whitman replied diplomatically. "I was just explaining that Grace needs more rest. The stress of pregnancy can be difficult, especially when there are other factors involved." Grace held her breath, praying that Dr. Whitman wouldn't mention the bruises or ask any probing questions while Richard was in the room. She knew from experience that any perceived betrayal or embarrassment would be paid for later, when there were no witnesses and no one to hear her explanations. "Stress?" Richard's voice rose slightly, and Grace instinctively drew her hands protectively over her belly. "What stress? I provide everything she needs. She doesn't work, doesn't have any responsibilities beyond taking care of herself and the baby." The irony of his words would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. Grace's days were filled with walking on eggshells, managing Richard's moods, and hiding the evidence of his increasing volatility. But she had learned that pointing out such contradictions only made things worse. Emma Richardson, the 29-year-old labor and delivery nurse, had been quietly organizing medical supplies in the corner of the room, but Richard's aggressive tone caught her attention. She had worked in obstetrics long enough to recognize the signs of domestic abuse, and the way Grace shrank away from her husband set off every alarm bell in her professional training. "Sir," Emma said politely but firmly, "perhaps it would be better if Mrs. Montgomery could finish her appointment without distractions. These conversations can be sensitive." Richard turned his attention to the nurse, his expression darkening further. Emma was a petite woman with kind eyes and gentle hands that had helped bring countless babies safely into the world, but she also possessed an inner strength that came from years of advocating for vulnerable patients. "Are you telling me I can't be present for my own wife's medical appointment?" Richard's voice carried the same tone he used in business negotiations when someone dared to challenge his authority. "I pay for the best medical care money can buy, and I expect to be informed about every aspect of my child's development." Grace watched the exchange with growing horror, recognizing the signs of Richard's temper building toward an explosion. She had seen him destroy business relationships over smaller perceived slights, and she knew that his need to maintain control extended far beyond their home. "Richard, please," Grace said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just finish the appointment and go home." But her attempt at peacekeeping only seemed to fuel his anger. "Don't you start taking their side against me," he snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that got us into trouble in the first place." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, her maternal instincts and professional obligations creating a protective barrier between Richard and the two women in the room. "Mr. Montgomery, I need you to lower your voice. This is a medical facility, and there are other patients who require a peaceful environment." Emma quietly positioned herself near the door, her nursing training kicking in as she recognized a potentially dangerous situation developing. She had seen too many cases where domestic violence escalated during pregnancy, when victims were at their most vulnerable and abusers felt threatened by the impending changes to their control structure. Richard's face flushed red with indignation. "You people seem to forget who you're dealing with," he said, his voice taking on a menacing quality that made Grace's blood run cold. "I have lawyers who specialize in medical malpractice, and I'm not afraid to use them if I feel my family isn't receiving appropriate care." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Grace felt the familiar sensation of the walls closing in around her. Richard's wealth and connections had always been weapons in his arsenal, tools he used to bend people to his will and silence anyone who dared to question his behavior. Emma's hand moved instinctively toward her phone, her fingers finding the device in her scrub's pocket. She had been trained in protocols for documenting suspected abuse, but she had never been in a situation where the evidence was unfolding in real time before her eyes. Dr. Whitman maintained her professional composure, but Grace could see the concern growing in her eyes. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside so I can complete Mrs. Montgomery's examination. Hospital policy requires that we maintain a safe environment for all patients." Richard's laugh was cold and humorless. "Safe environment? The only danger here is from medical professionals who don't know their place. My wife doesn't need protection from me. She needs protection from people who fill her head with nonsense about stress and complications." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. Crying in front of Richard was always a mistake, seen as manipulation or weakness depending on his mood. She had learned to save her tears for private moments when she could grieve for the life she had lost and the woman she used to be. Emma watched the interaction with growing alarm, noting the way Grace seemed to fold in on herself with every word Richard spoke. The nurse had received training in recognizing the signs of intimate partner violence, and everything about the situation screamed danger. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of medical equipment humming in the background and Grace's shallow breathing. Richard stood like a predator, deciding whether to strike, his expensive suit and polished exterior hiding the darkness that Grace knew lurked beneath. Dr. Whitman made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm calling security to escort you to the waiting area. Mrs. Montgomery needs medical attention, and your presence is interfering with her care." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, his face contorting with rage at being dismissed and challenged in front of witnesses. Grace closed her eyes, knowing that this public humiliation would be paid for tenfold once they were alone. "You'll regret this," Richard said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "All of you will regret this." Emma's finger hovered over the record button on her phone, hidden in her pocket. Every instinct told her that whatever happened next needed to be documented, preserved as evidence of the danger that Grace and her unborn baby were facing. The chapter ended with Richard's hand raised and Grace cowering, while Emma's finger finally pressed record, capturing the moment that would expose a millionaire's carefully constructed facade and set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. The slap echoed through the examination room like a gunshot, sharp and devastating in the sterile silence. Grace's head snapped to the side from the force of Richard's blow, her hand instinctively flying to her cheek while her other arm curved protectively around her swollen belly. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a brutal punctuation mark that shattered any pretense of civility. "You embarrassed me," Richard hissed, his voice low and venomous, as he loomed over his wife's hunched form. The millionaire husband who commanded respect in boardrooms across the city had finally shown his true face, the mask of sophistication stripped away to reveal the narcissistic abuser beneath. Emma Richardson felt her blood turn to ice as she witnessed the assault, but her nursing training kicked in immediately. She stepped forward with the courage of someone who had sworn an oath to protect the vulnerable, her phone still recording in her pocket as she placed herself between Richard and Grace. "Sir, you need to leave now," Emma said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. At 29, she had seen enough domestic violence cases to know that this moment was a crossroads. Either she acted to protect her patient, or Grace Montgomery would likely end up as another tragic statistic. Richard whirled around to face the nurse, his fury now directed at this new target who dared to challenge his authority. His face was flushed red with anger, his expensive suit disheveled from the violent outburst, and his perfectly styled hair had fallen across his forehead. The transformation from polished businessman to dangerous predator was complete. "Mind your own business," Richard snapped, pointing a threatening finger at Emma. "This is between me and my wife. You have no right to interfere in private family matters." But Emma had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. Years of medical training had taught her that domestic violence during pregnancy posed extreme risk to both mother and child, and she would not stand by while a patient was attacked in her presence. "Mr. Montgomery, what you just did constitutes assault," Emma said firmly, her small frame somehow projecting an authority that seemed to fill the room. "I'm a mandatory reporter, and I have a legal obligation to document what I witnessed." Grace remained frozen in her chair, one hand still pressed to her burning cheek while the other cradled her belly. At 7 months pregnant, she felt more vulnerable than ever, trapped between her husband's rage and a nurse who didn't understand the consequences of standing up to Richard Montgomery. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Richard said, his voice taking on the cold, calculated tone that had destroyed business rivals and silenced potential whistleblowers. "I own half this city. My lawyers will bury you so deep in litigation that you'll never work again." The threats that had cowed so many others over the years fell flat in the face of Emma's determination. She had dealt with bullies before, men who believed that money and power gave them the right to hurt the people who depended on them. Her own sister had been trapped in an abusive marriage, and Emma had sworn never to turn away when she saw the signs. "Threaten me all you want," Emma replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But you just assaulted a pregnant woman in front of a witness, and I recorded every second of it." The mention of recording made Richard's face go white with shock and fury. In his world of carefully managed public relations and strategic image control, the idea that his private behavior might be documented was his worst nightmare. "You recorded me?" Richard's voice rose to a roar. "That's illegal. You can't record someone without their consent." Dr. Patricia Whitman chose that moment to return to the examination room, drawn by the raised voices and the sound of conflict. The 52-year-old physician took in the scene instantly, Grace cowering with a red handprint on her face, Emma standing protectively nearby with her chin raised in defiance, and Richard Montgomery looking like a cornered animal. Dr. Whitman had been practicing medicine for over 20 years, and she had developed an instinct for dangerous situations. Without hesitation, she reached for the emergency button that would summon hospital security, her finger hovering over the alarm as she assessed the threat level. "What happened here?" Dr. Whitman asked, though the evidence was written clearly on Grace's face and in the tension that filled the room like a toxic cloud. "Your nurse has been recording private conversations without consent," Richard said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I want her fired immediately, and I want all recordings destroyed." But Dr. Whitman had noticed Grace's red cheek and the way she had shrunk into herself, and she knew exactly what had transpired. As a physician, she was also a mandatory reporter with legal obligations that superseded any threats from wealthy patients. "Emma," Dr. Whitman said calmly, "please call security. Mr. Montgomery needs to be escorted from the premises immediately." Richard's composure finally cracked completely. "You people have no idea what you're doing," he snarled. "I'll destroy all of you. I'll sue this hospital into bankruptcy. I'll make sure you never practice medicine again." Emma continued recording, capturing every threat and promise of retaliation. She knew that Richard's words were providing additional evidence of his character and his willingness to use his wealth and power as weapons against anyone who dared to protect his wife. "Mr. Montgomery," Dr. Whitman said with the authority of someone who had spent decades advocating for patients, "you are no longer welcome in this medical facility. Any further contact with Mrs. Montgomery or our staff will be considered harassment." Grace finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Richard, please, let's just go home." The plea broke Emma's heart, recognizing the desperate hope of a woman who still believed that compliance might save her from further punishment. But it was too late for compromise. The line had been crossed, the evidence had been captured, and the wheels of justice were already beginning to turn. "This isn't over," Richard said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper as hospital security appeared in the doorway. Two uniformed guards flanked the entrance, their presence immediately changing the power dynamic in the room. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the lead security guard said, his tone professional but firm. These men had dealt with distraught family members before, but they could sense that this situation was different, more dangerous. Richard looked around the room one final time, his gaze lingering on each face as if memorizing them for future retribution. Grace, Emma, and Dr. Whitman stood united against him, three women who had decided that enough was enough. "You have no idea what you've started," Richard said as the security guards moved to escort him from the room. "I'll make sure all of you regret this day for the rest of your lives." As Richard was led away, his threats echoing down the hospital corridor, Emma finally stopped recording. Her hands were shaking as she looked at her phone, realizing that she now possessed evidence that could either save Grace Montgomery's life or potentially destroy her own career. Dr. Whitman immediately turned her attention to Grace, whose shock was beginning to give way to panic. The pregnant woman's face was pale except for the angry red mark where her husband had struck her, and her breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. "Grace," Dr. Whitman said gently, kneeling beside her patient's chair, "you're safe now. He can't hurt you here." But Grace knew better than to believe in temporary safety. Richard's influence extended far beyond the walls of any hospital, and his threats were never empty promises. She had seen him destroy people who had crossed him in much smaller ways, and she couldn't imagine what he would do to the women who had just humiliated him so publicly. "You don't understand," Grace whispered, finally allowing the tears to fall. "He'll never forgive this. He'll make all of us pay." Emma approached cautiously, her heart breaking for the woman who had endured so much for so long. "Mrs. Montgomery, we have evidence now. We can help you. You don't have to go back to him." The offer of help should have been a lifeline, but to Grace it felt like a death sentence. Richard had systematically isolated her from friends and family, controlled their finances, and made himself the center of her entire world. The idea of life without him was both terrifying and impossible to imagine. "You recorded him hitting me," Grace said, looking at Emma with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "What happens now?" Emma and Dr. Whitman exchanged glances, both women understanding the gravity of the situation they had entered. They had the evidence to expose a millionaire's abuse, but they also had a frightened pregnant woman who wasn't sure she wanted to be saved. The chapter ended with Grace's question hanging in the air, the recording safe on Emma's phone, and Richard Montgomery somewhere in the hospital corridors, plotting his revenge against the women who had dared to stand up to him. The battle lines had been drawn, and there would be no turning back for any of them. Emma Richardson sat alone in the hospital break room, her hands trembling as she stared at the phone that contained the most important recording of her life. The small device seemed to pulse with dangerous energy, holding within its memory the evidence that could either save Grace Montgomery or destroy everyone who had witnessed Richard's violent outburst. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every word of Richard's threats, the sickening sound of his hands striking Grace's face, and her whimpered response. Emma had listened to it 3 times already, each replay making her more certain that she had done the right thing, even as her stomach churned with fear about the consequences. Dr. Patricia Whitman entered the break room quietly, her own face etched with concern. At 52, she had seen enough domestic violence cases to know that the next few hours would be critical for Grace's safety and their own professional futures. Richard Montgomery wasn't the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully. "How is she?" Emma asked, looking up from her phone as Dr. Whitman poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Physically, she'll heal," Dr. Whitman replied, settling into the chair across from Emma. "The bruising on her face will fade, and the baby seems unaffected by the stress, but emotionally, she's terrified. She keeps asking what we're going to do with the recording." Emma touched her phone protectively. "This isn't the first time he's hit her, is it?" Dr. Whitman shook her head grimly. "I've been Grace's physician for 8 months now, and I've suspected abuse almost from the beginning. Today was just the first time I saw it happen directly." The two women sat in silence for a moment, processing the weight of their shared knowledge. As healthcare providers, they were mandatory reporters with legal obligations that superseded any personal fears about Richard's threats and influence. "I've been going through her medical records," Dr. Whitman continued, pulling a thick file from her bag. "Look at this pattern." She spread Grace's charts across the break room table, pointing to documented injuries that told a story of escalating violence. A broken wrist explained as a fall downstairs, bruised ribs attributed to a car accident, repeated urinary tract infections that could indicate sexual assault. 6 months of excuses, Emma said, studying the medical documentation with growing horror. "How did no one see this pattern before?" "We saw it," Dr. Whitman replied quietly. "But seeing it and proving it are two different things. Wealthy abusers are particularly skilled at maintaining appearances and silencing victims. Richard Montgomery's reputation and resources made it nearly impossible to challenge him without concrete evidence." Emma picked up her phone again, looking at the recording that had changed everything. "Until now." Meanwhile, Grace sat in her Mercedes in the hospital parking lot, afraid to start the engine and drive home to face Richard's fury. Her cheek still throbbed where he had struck her, and she could see the red mark beginning to darken in the rearview mirror. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror of what would happen when she walked through their front door. With shaking fingers, she dialed her best friend's number, the only person in her life that Richard hadn't completely succeeded in driving away. Margaret Thompson, known to everyone as Maggie, was a successful divorce attorney who had watched Richard's systematic destruction of Grace's independence with growing alarm. "Grace!" Maggie's voice was filled with immediate concern. "What's wrong? You sound terrible." "Something happened at the doctor's office," Grace whispered, glancing around the parking lot as if Richard might materialize from behind any car. "Maggie, I think I'm in real trouble this time." Maggie had been waiting for this call for months, dreading it even as she prepared for it. As a divorce attorney specializing in domestic violence cases, she recognized the signs of escalating abuse and had been documenting Richard's behavior through Grace's increasingly rare phone calls and canceled social engagements. "Where are you now?" Maggie asked, already reaching for her car keys. "Are you safe?" "I'm in the hospital parking lot," Grace replied, her voice breaking. "He hit me in front of the doctor and nurse. They saw everything. I don't know what to do." The confession hung between them like a bridge finally built after years of dancing around the truth. Maggie had suspected that Richard was physically abusive, but Grace had never admitted it directly until this moment. "Stay right where you are," Maggie commanded. "I'm coming to get you. Don't go home, Grace. Promise me you won't go home." But even as Grace agreed to wait, both women knew that she was trapped in a web of financial dependence and systematic isolation that Richard had carefully constructed over years of marriage. Their joint bank accounts, their shared assets, even Grace's car were all controlled by Richard's financial empire. Back in the break room, Emma was making copies of the recording while Dr. Whitman documented the incident in Grace's medical file. They both understood that preserving evidence was crucial, but they also knew that Richard's legal team would challenge everything they had collected. "I keep thinking about what he said," Emma admitted as she saved multiple copies of the audio file to different devices. "About owning half the city, about his lawyers. What if he really can destroy us?" Dr. Whitman looked up from her notes, her expression determined despite her obvious concerns. Then we'll face it together. But that woman and her baby deserve better than living in fear of a man who thinks his money gives him the right to abuse them. The recording wasn't just evidence of a single incident. It was proof of a pattern of behavior that had been hidden behind Richard Montgomery's carefully crafted public persona. His threats against the hospital staff, his possessive language about Grace, and his complete lack of remorse for striking a pregnant woman painted a picture of a dangerous narcissist whose wealth had enabled his abuse for far too long. "What do we do next?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "We report it," Dr. Whitman replied firmly, "to hospital administration, to the police, and to Child Protective Services. Our legal obligations are clear, regardless of how much money Richard Montgomery has." As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Whitman's pager buzzed with an urgent message from the hospital's legal department. Richard's attorneys had already called, demanding that any recordings be turned over immediately and threatening lawsuits against both the hospital and its staff. "He works fast," Emma observed, reading the message over Dr. Whitman's shoulder. "His lawyers are already trying to suppress the evidence." "Then we need to work faster," Dr. Whitman replied, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling Detective Sarah Brooks. She specializes in domestic violence cases involving wealthy perpetrators." Grace's medical records revealed a disturbing pattern that went beyond the obvious physical injuries. Her isolation from friends and family, her financial dependence, and her repeated explanations for injuries all pointed to a systematic campaign of control and abuse that had escalated throughout her pregnancy. Emma studied the photographs that Dr. Whitman had taken of Grace's injuries over the months, seeing them now with new understanding. Each bruise, each explanation, each nervous glance toward the door, when Richard was mentioned, told the story of a woman trapped in a nightmare of her own wealth and social status. "Look at this," Dr. Whitman said, pointing to a note in Grace's file from 3 months earlier. "She asked me about the safety of sleeping pills during pregnancy. When I asked why she was having trouble sleeping, she said she was worried about making mistakes that would upset her husband." The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality of a pregnant woman so terrorized by her husband that she couldn't sleep peacefully in her own home. Emma felt her resolve strengthen as she realized that the recording on her phone might be the key to freeing Grace and countless other women from Richard Montgomery's abuse. "We have to protect this evidence," Emma said, holding up her phone. "This recording could save her life." Dr. Whitman nodded, making the final notes in Grace's file before sealing it in an envelope marked for the police. "And it could save the lives of other women who haven't found the courage to speak up yet." As the two women prepared to contact the authorities, neither of them knew that Richard Montgomery was already 3 steps ahead, his team of high-powered attorneys crafting a legal strategy designed to discredit the evidence and destroy anyone who dared to challenge his version of events. The battle for Grace Montgomery's freedom was about to begin, and the recording in Emma's phone would be the weapon that either saved her or condemned them all to Richard's promised revenge. Detective Sarah Brooks arrived at the medical center exactly 47 minutes after Dr. Whitman's call, her unmarked sedan pulling into the hospital parking lot as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. At 41 years old, Brooks had spent the last 8 years working domestic violence cases in the city's most affluent neighborhoods, and she knew that wealth often made abusers more dangerous, not less. The detective's reputation for handling high-profile cases involving powerful men made her the perfect choice for the Grace Montgomery situation. She had seen too many women terrorized by millionaire husbands who used their resources as weapons, and she understood that this case would require careful documentation and ironclad evidence to overcome the inevitable legal challenges. Emma Richardson waited nervously in the hospital conference room, the recorded evidence loaded onto 3 separate devices in case Richard's legal team attempted to confiscate or suppress the material. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared to share the most damning audio recording of domestic violence she had ever witnessed. "Ms. Richardson," Detective Brooks said as she entered the conference room, her voice professional but warm. Dr. Whitman explained the situation over the phone. "I understand you have audio evidence of an assault on Mrs. Montgomery." Emma nodded, pulling out her phone with fingers that trembled despite her determination to see justice done. "I recorded the entire incident. Richard Montgomery struck his pregnant wife in front of witnesses, then threatened to destroy anyone who reported it. The detective connected Emma's phone to a professional audio system, the crystal-clear recording filling the conference room with Richard's voice, cold and menacing. Brooks listened intently, taking detailed notes as the sound of the slap echoed through the speakers, followed by Grace's whimpered response and Richard's immediate threats. "This is excellent evidence," Detective Brooks said when the recording ended. "Clean audio, multiple witnesses, and clear documentation of both the assault and the subsequent intimidation attempts. How long have you suspected domestic violence in this relationship?" Dr. Whitman spread Grace's medical records across the conference table, pointing to the pattern of injuries and explanations that had raised red flags over the previous months. "I've been documenting suspected abuse for nearly 6 months, but this is the first time we've had direct evidence." The medical documentation painted a disturbing picture of escalating violence that coincided with Grace's pregnancy. Domestic violence often increased during pregnancy, when abusers felt threatened by their diminishing control and their victims' increased vulnerability. "Where is Mrs. Montgomery now?" Detective Brooks asked, already knowing that victim cooperation would be crucial for any successful prosecution. "She's in the parking lot with her friend Margaret Thompson," Dr. Whitman replied. "She's terrified of going home and facing her husband's reaction to this incident." Brooks nodded grimly. The immediate aftermath of exposure was often the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims, especially when wealthy abusers felt their carefully constructed public personas threatened by potential legal consequences. "I need to interview Mrs. Montgomery separately using techniques designed to overcome victim reluctance," Brooks explained. "Wealthy abusers are particularly skilled at convincing their victims that no one will believe them, or that the consequences of speaking up will be worse than continued abuse." The detective had extensive training in interviewing traumatized victims, understanding that years of psychological manipulation often made it difficult for women like Grace to trust law enforcement or believe that justice was possible. 20 minutes later, Grace Montgomery sat across from Detective Brooks in a private hospital consultation room, her friend Maggie Thompson providing moral support from a nearby chair. Grace's face still bore the red mark of Richard's handprint, and her entire body language screamed of someone expecting to be punished for speaking the truth. "Mrs. Montgomery," Detective Brooks began gently, "I want you to know that what happened to you today was a crime. Your husband assaulted you in front of witnesses, and we have clear evidence of that assault." Grace's initial response was exactly what Brooks had expected from an abuse victim who had been conditioned to protect her abuser. "Detective, you don't understand. Richard is under tremendous pressure with a major development deal. He's not usually like this." The familiar litany of excuses and justifications flowed from Grace's lips as naturally as breathing. She had spent months, possibly years, making excuses for Richard's behavior, convincing herself that his abuse was somehow her fault or the result of external stressors. "Grace," Maggie interrupted, her voice filled with the authority of someone who had spent years prosecuting domestic violence cases. "Listen to yourself. You're making excuses for a man who just hit you while you're 7 months pregnant." Detective Brooks allowed the friend's intervention to settle before continuing her careful questioning. "Mrs. Montgomery, I've reviewed your medical records with Dr. Whitman's permission. This pattern of injuries isn't consistent with accidents or clumsiness. When did the physical abuse begin?" The question hung in the air as Grace struggled with years of denial and self-protection. Admitting that the abuse was deliberate and ongoing would mean acknowledging that her entire marriage was built on a foundation of fear and control. "It started small," Grace finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "A push here, a grab there. He said I was being dramatic when I complained. Then it got worse after I got pregnant." The confession opened the floodgates, and Grace began describing a pattern of escalating violence that had been carefully hidden behind Richard's public persona as a successful businessman and devoted husband. The millionaire husband who appeared charming and generous in public became a monster behind closed doors. "He controls everything," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength as she finally spoke the truth aloud. "Our bank accounts, my credit cards, even my phone usage. He monitors my calls and emails. I can't go anywhere or see anyone without his permission." Detective Brooks documented every detail, recognizing the classic signs of financial abuse that often accompanied physical violence in relationships involving wealthy perpetrators. Richard Montgomery had used his resources to create a prison of dependence around his wife. "Mrs. Montgomery, I need you to understand something." Brooks said, leaning forward with intensity. Your husband's wealth doesn't make him immune to prosecution. We have evidence, witnesses, and documentation. We can protect you and your baby, but you have to be willing to cooperate with our investigation. But even as Grace nodded agreement, Detective Brooks could see the fear in her eyes. Richard Montgomery's threats weren't empty bluster. He had the resources and connections to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. He's already called his lawyers, Grace said, confirming Brooks' suspicions. By now, he's probably spinning this whole incident as some kind of medical malpractice conspiracy. Richard never leaves anything to chance. Maggie reached over to squeeze her friend's hand. Grace, you don't have to go back to him. You can stay with me until we figure out a long-term solution. And go where? Grace asked, the hopelessness clear in her voice. He controls our finances. I don't have access to money, credit cards, or even my own identification documents. Everything is in his name or controlled by his companies. Detective Brooks had heard similar stories from other wealthy abuse victims, women who found themselves trapped not by physical barriers, but by financial dependence and social isolation. Mrs. Montgomery, there are resources available for women in your situation. Shelters, legal aid organizations, and support groups specifically designed to help victims of domestic violence break free from their abusers. But Grace's response revealed the depth of Richard's psychological manipulation. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Richard Montgomery has lawyers who specialize in destroying people who cross him. He has private investigators, business connections, and enough money to drag this out until everyone gives up. The detective's jaw tightened with determination. She had faced wealthy abusers before, men who believed their money made them untouchable. Mrs. Montgomery, I've been investigating domestic violence for 8 years, and I've never met an abuser who was more powerful than the legal system when we had solid evidence. As if to prove Grace's point about Richard's resources and connections, Detective Brooks's phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor. Richard Montgomery's legal team had already contacted the police department, demanding that the investigation be dropped and threatening lawsuits against the city if the matter proceeded. He works fast, Brooks muttered, showing the message to Grace and Maggie. His attorneys are already trying to intimidate us into dropping the case. Grace's face went pale as she realized that Richard's promised retaliation was already beginning. See? This is what I was afraid of. He'll destroy everyone who tried to help me, and I'll still end up trapped with him. But Detective Brooks had seen this pattern before, and she knew that backing down in the face of legal threats only emboldened abusers like Richard Montgomery. Mrs. Montgomery, running scared, is exactly what he wants. We have evidence, witnesses, and the law on our side. He can threaten all he wants, but justice doesn't depend on how much money someone has. The chapter ended with Grace facing an impossible choice: cooperate with the investigation and face Richard's promised destruction of everyone who helped her, or return to a life of abuse and terror with a man whose violence was escalating as his control slipped away. Detective Brooks prepared to take the case to the district attorney's office, knowing that prosecuting Richard Montgomery would require every ounce of skill and determination she possessed. The battle for Grace Montgomery's freedom was about to become a war between justice and wealth, with the lives of everyone involved hanging in the balance. Richard Montgomery's attorney, Marcus Sterling, arrived at the police station exactly 3 hours after the hospital incident, his black Mercedes pulling up to the curb with the confidence of a man who had never lost a legal battle. At 55 years old, Sterling was renowned for representing wealthy clients who found themselves in compromising situations, and his reputation for aggressive legal tactics preceded him like a storm cloud. Sterling strode through the police station lobby with the bearing of someone who owned the building, his $1,000 suit in Italian leather briefcase announcing his status to everyone present. He had built his career on making problems disappear for clients who could afford his services, and Richard Montgomery was exactly the type of millionaire husband who needed his particular brand of legal protection. I'm here to see Detective Brooks regarding the harassment of my client, Richard Montgomery, Sterling announced to the desk sergeant, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately. I trust this misunderstanding can be resolved quickly and quietly. Ta-ta. But Detective Brooks had been expecting this legal assault, and she met Sterling in the police station conference room with her own preparation complete. The audio recording was secured in evidence, witness statements had been taken, and the district attorney's office had already been briefed on the case. "Mr. Sterling," Detective Brooks said, gesturing to a chair across from her, "I assume you're here about your client's assault of his pregnant wife in front of medical witnesses?" Sterling's smile was as cold as winter rain. "Detective, my client is the victim here. He was ambushed in a medical facility by staff members who conspired to create a compromising situation, then illegally recorded private conversations without consent." The attorney produced a thick folder of legal documents from his briefcase, spreading them across the table like weapons being deployed for battle. Restraining orders, cease and desist notices, and preliminary injunctions designed to tie up the investigation in legal red tape. "As you can see," Sterling continued, "we're prepared to file harassment charges against Dr. Whitman and the nurse, Emma Richardson. We're also pursuing invasion of privacy claims and demanding that all recordings be turned over to us immediately." Detective Brooks reviewed the legal documents with the weariness of someone who had seen wealthy defendants try to lawyer their way out of accountability before. "Mr. Sterling, your client was recorded assaulting his wife by a mandatory reporter during the commission of a crime. The recording is evidence, not harassment. My client was defending himself against false accusations made by medical professionals who were clearly biased against him," Sterling replied smoothly. "The so-called assault was actually my client trying to prevent his emotionally unstable wife from harming herself and their unborn child." Aitunum. The legal spin was masterful, turning Richard from aggressor to protector in a single sentence. Sterling had spent years crafting narratives that transformed his clients from perpetrators into victims, and he was particularly skilled at exploiting societal assumptions about pregnant women's emotional stability. Meanwhile, across town, Jake Sullivan was reviewing a file that had been anonymously delivered to his office that morning. At 45 years old, Sullivan specialized in domestic violence cases involving wealthy perpetrators, and someone had obviously decided that he needed to know about Grace Montgomery's situation. The file contained medical records, photographs of injuries, and detailed documentation of Richard Montgomery's pattern of abusive behavior. Sullivan recognized the careful preparation of someone who had been gathering evidence for months, waiting for the right moment to act. Sullivan's secretary buzzed his intercom. "Mr. Sullivan, there's a Margaret Thompson here to see you. She says it's urgent and involves domestic violence." Maggie Thompson entered Sullivan's office carrying her own thick file of documentation, her expression grim with the determination of someone who had watched her best friend suffer for too long. As a divorce attorney herself, she understood the challenges of prosecuting wealthy abusers, but she also knew that remaining silent was no longer an option. "Mr. Sullivan," Maggie began, setting her file on his desk, "I need your help protecting a friend who's being abused by her millionaire husband. I've been documenting the abuse for months, but today things escalated to physical violence in front of witnesses." Sullivan opened Maggie's file and found a treasure trove of evidence that most domestic violence cases lacked. Photographs of Grace's injuries taken with timestamps, recordings of threatening phone messages from Richard, and financial documents showing the systematic control he exercised over their marital assets. "Mrs. Thompson, this is extremely thorough documentation," Sullivan said, reviewing the carefully organized evidence. "How long have you been preparing this case?" "6 months," Maggie replied. "Ever since Grace started making excuses for injuries that were obviously not accidental. I knew that when the time came to act, we'd need overwhelming evidence to counter Richard Montgomery's wealth and influence." Sullivan had heard of Richard Montgomery, of course. The real estate developer's name appeared regularly in the business sections of local newspapers, and his reputation as a successful entrepreneur was matched only by his reputation as a ruthless negotiator who destroyed anyone who crossed him. "The timing is perfect," Sullivan said, reaching for his phone. "There was an incident at the hospital today involving your friend. Do you know anything about that?" Maggie nodded grimly. "Grace called me from the hospital parking lot. Richard hit her in front of Dr. Whitman and a nurse. They recorded the assault, and now Richard's lawyers are trying to suppress the evidence." While Sullivan and Maggie strategized about the legal approach to protecting Grace, the recording that Emma Richardson had captured was spreading beyond the hospital's walls in ways that none of them had anticipated. A hospital employee with access to the evidence had leaked the audio to a local news blogger who specialized in exposing powerful men's abuse of women. The blogger, Sarah Chen, had built her reputation on investigating cases of domestic violence among the city's elite, and the Richard Montgomery recording was exactly the type of explosive content that her audience craved. Within hours of receiving the leak, she had verified the authenticity of the audio and posted it online with the headline, "Millionaire developer caught on recording assaulting pregnant wife." The social media response was immediate and overwhelming. The recording went viral within hours, shared thousands of times by users who were outraged by the clear sound of Richard striking Grace and his subsequent threats against the medical staff who witnessed the assault. Richard Montgomery's carefully constructed public image crumbled in real time as the recording spread across social media platforms. The man who had spent years cultivating relationships with city officials, business leaders, and social elite suddenly found himself branded as a domestic abuser whose violent behavior had been exposed for the world to hear. Grace watched the news coverage from Maggie's apartment, horrified by the public attention, but also amazed by the outpouring of support from complete strangers who rallied to her defense. Women's rights organizations began organizing protests outside Richard's business offices, demanding justice for Grace and accountability for her abuser. "I can't believe this is happening," Grace said, scrolling through hundreds of supportive comments from women who shared their own stories of domestic violence. "All these years I thought I was alone, and now I see that there are so many others who understand exactly what I've been through." The viral recording had accomplished something that months of private suffering could never achieve. It had broken through Richard Montgomery's wall of wealth and influence to expose the truth about his character. No amount of money or legal maneuvering could undo the damage to his reputation that came from hearing his own voice caught in an act of domestic violence. But Richard's legal team was already adapting their strategy to address the public relations nightmare. Marcus Sterling held an emergency press conference, painting his client as the victim of a coordinated attack by disgruntled medical professionals and a vindictive wife who was trying to extort money through false allegations. "My client is devastated by these false accusations," Sterling told the assembled reporters. "Richard Montgomery is a devoted husband and father-to-be who has never harmed his wife. The recording was obtained illegally and has been taken completely out of context by people who are trying to destroy a good man's reputation." The legal battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side, Grace Montgomery, supported by evidence, witnesses, and a growing army of advocates who refused to let wealth silence justice. On the other, Richard Montgomery, backed by high-powered attorneys, financial resources, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Detective Brooks prepared for the fight of her career, knowing that prosecuting Richard Montgomery would require every legal tool at her disposal. The recording had given them the evidence they needed, but converting that evidence into a conviction would require navigating a legal minefield designed to protect wealthy defendants from accountability. The chapter ended with the viral recording continuing to spread across social media. Grace's story inspiring other victims to come forward with their own accusations against Richard Montgomery, and Marcus Sterling's legal team working around the clock to contain the damage to their client's reputation and freedom. Rebecca Montgomery arrived at Grace's temporary refuge exactly 48 hours after the hospital incident, her silver Bentley gliding up to Maggie Thompson's modest law office like a predator stalking its prey. At 65 years old, Richard's mother had spent decades perfecting the art of damage control for her son's various indiscretions, and she viewed Grace's rebellion as just another problem to be solved with money and manipulation. Rebecca cut an imposing figure as she entered the law office, her designer clothes and expensive jewelry announcing her wealth and status to everyone present. She had not come to offer support or sympathy. She had come to protect the Montgomery family fortune from what she viewed as a gold-digging daughter-in-law who was trying to exploit an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Mrs. Montgomery," Maggie said, rising from her desk to greet the unexpected visitor. "I wasn't expecting you." Rebecca's smile was as cold as Arctic wind. "Ms. Thompson, I'm here to discuss a reasonable resolution to this unfortunate situation involving my son and daughter-in-law. I believe it would be in everyone's best interest to settle this matter privately." Grace emerged from the office conference room where she had been reviewing legal documents with Jake Sullivan, her face pale but determined. The bruising from Richard's slap had darkened to ugly purple and yellow patches, making her look like a victim in a way that no amount of makeup could disguise. "Rebecca," Grace said quietly, instinctively crossing her arms protectively over her pregnant belly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Grace, dear," Rebecca replied, her voice dripping with false concern. "I've come to help you through this difficult time. I know that pregnancy hormones can make women feel confused and emotional, and I think we can find a way to resolve this misunderstanding that benefits everyone involved." The condescending tone was exactly what Grace had endured for years from Richard's family, who had never fully accepted her into their elite social circle. Rebecca had always viewed Grace as an outsider who didn't deserve the Montgomery name or fortune. "This isn't a misunderstanding," Grace said, finding strength in her voice that surprised everyone in the room. "Your son assaulted me in front of witnesses. There's a recording of him hitting me while I'm 7 months pregnant." Rebecca waved dismissively, as if the evidence were merely an inconvenient detail to be managed. "Grace, you know how the media loves to sensationalize these types of domestic disputes. Richard is under tremendous pressure with his business deals, and sometimes that stress affects his judgment." Jake Sullivan stepped forward, his experience with wealthy families making him immediately wary of Rebecca's motives. "Mrs. Montgomery, are you here in some official capacity, or is this a social visit?" "Mr. Sullivan, I'm here to offer Grace a generous settlement that would allow her to start fresh without the trauma of a lengthy legal battle," Rebecca replied, producing an envelope from her designer purse. $25 million, complete financial independence, and a beautiful new life for her and the baby. The offer hung in the air like a poisoned apple, beautiful on the surface but deadly to anyone who accepted it. Grace stared at the envelope, knowing that it represented more money than she had ever dreamed of possessing, but also understanding that it came with strings that would bind her forever. "And in exchange?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. "A simple non-disclosure agreement," Rebecca replied smoothly. "Grace agrees not to discuss private family matters publicly, and Richard agrees to provide generous ongoing support for her and the child. Everyone wins." The non-disclosure agreement was the standard weapon used by wealthy families to silence inconvenient victims. $25 million would buy Grace's silence and allow Richard to continue his pattern of abuse with the next woman who fell into his trap. "Mrs. Montgomery," Jake Sullivan said firmly, "your son committed a crime. He assaulted a pregnant woman, and there's clear evidence of that assault. You can't buy your way out of criminal charges." Rebecca's pleasant facade cracked slightly, revealing the steel beneath her grandmother exterior. "Mr. Sullivan, you seem to be under the impression that this recording constitutes admissible evidence. My son's legal team has already filed motions to suppress any illegally obtained recordings on grounds of privacy violation." The legal challenge to the recording's admissibility was exactly what everyone had feared. Marcus Sterling's team was arguing that Emma Richardson had violated hospital privacy policies by recording in a medical facility without proper consent, potentially making the evidence inadmissible in court. "Even if you suppress the recording," Maggie interjected, "we still have witness testimony from Dr. Whitman and Emma Richardson, plus months of documented medical evidence showing a pattern of abuse." "Ms. Thompson," Rebecca said with icy precision, "Dr. Whitman and the nurse are facing their own legal troubles. Richard's attorneys have filed malpractice suits against both of them, claiming they conspired to create a hostile environment that led to the unfortunate incident. Hospital administration is already distancing themselves from their staff to avoid liability." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Emma Richardson and Dr. Whitman were facing professional destruction because they had tried to protect her, and now Rebecca was offering her a way to escape while leaving her protectors to face Richard's legal assault alone. "You're trying to isolate the witnesses," Jake Sullivan observed, recognizing the sophisticated legal strategy designed to eliminate everyone who could testify against Richard. "Destroy their credibility, bankrupt them with legal fees, and make them too afraid to testify." Rebecca's smile returned, acknowledging the accuracy of Sullivan's assessment. "Mr. Sullivan, my family has been dealing with business disputes for 3 generations. We understand that sometimes people get caught up in situations they don't fully comprehend, and we prefer to resolve matters efficiently rather than destroying innocent bystanders unnecessarily." The threat was clear. accept the money and disappear quietly, or watch everyone who tried to help Grace get destroyed by Richard's legal machine. It was sophisticated blackmail disguised as generous charity. Grace felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Emma Richardson had risked her career to protect Grace and her unborn baby, and now the nurse was facing professional ruin because she had recorded Richard's assault. "What about the other women?" Grace asked quietly, thinking about the viral social media response that had brought forward other victims of Richard's abuse. "The recording has encouraged other women to speak up about their experiences with Richard. Are you going to silence them too?" Rebecca's expression hardened completely. "Grace, those women are opportunists who are trying to exploit this unfortunate situation for their own gain. They have no real evidence, just convenient stories that emerged after the media attention began." But Grace had read the social media posts, the detailed accounts from women who had worked for Richard's company, dated him before their marriage, or encountered him in business settings. The pattern of controlling behavior and explosive anger was consistent across multiple accounts spanning several years. "I won't take your money," Grace said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Emma Richardson and Dr. Whitman shouldn't have to face legal destruction because they protected me and my baby. Your son is a domestic abuser, and no amount of money will change that fact." Rebecca's facade cracked completely, revealing the ruthless woman who had enabled and protected her son's behavior for years. "Grace, you have no idea what you're choosing. Richard has resources that can make your life very difficult. This recording scandal will blow over, but the legal consequences of defying us will last forever." "Let them come," Grace replied, placing her hands protectively over her pregnant belly. "I'm tired of being afraid. My daughter deserves better than growing up thinking it's normal for men to hurt women." Jake Sullivan felt a surge of admiration for his client's courage, knowing that she was choosing the difficult path of justice over the easy escape of financial settlement. "Mrs. Montgomery, you can leave now. My client has made her position clear." As Rebecca gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she delivered one final threat disguised as maternal concern. "Grace, dear, you're making a terrible mistake. Richard's legal team has resources that your small-town attorneys can't possibly match. When this is over, you'll have nothing left except regret." The door closed behind Rebecca Montgomery with a soft click that sounded like the final battle line being drawn. Grace had chosen justice over money, truth over silence, and courage over fear. But the consequences of that choice would test everyone involved in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Meanwhile, Richard's legal assault was escalating on multiple fronts. Marcus Sterling had filed malpractice suits against Dr. Whitman in the hospital, claiming that their staff had conspired to create a hostile environment that led to the incident. Emma Richardson was facing professional review boards and potential loss of her nursing license for allegedly violating patient privacy policies. The viral recording continued to spread across social media, but Richard's public relations team was working to counter the narrative by releasing carefully edited security footage from the hospital that made his behavior appear less aggressive and more defensive. The chapter ended with Grace's courageous refusal to accept Rebecca's blood money, Emma Richardson preparing to fight for her professional survival, and Richard Montgomery's legal team launching a coordinated attack designed to destroy everyone who dared to stand up to a millionaire's abuse of power. Grace Montgomery went into premature labor at exactly 34 weeks gestation, her body responding to the overwhelming stress of legal battles, media attention, and the constant fear of Richard's retaliation. The contractions began while she was reviewing legal documents in Jake Sullivan's office, sharp pains that doubled her over and sent Maggie racing to call an ambulance. Emma Richardson was working her regular shift in the labor and delivery unit when Grace arrived via emergency transport, her face pale with pain and terror. The irony wasn't lost on either woman that Grace would give birth in the same hospital where her husband had assaulted her just days before. But Emma's professional training took over as she prepared to help deliver the baby who had become the center of so much controversy. "Grace, you're going to be okay," Emma said, taking her patient's hand as the medical team prepared for an emergency delivery. "Your baby is premature but viable at 34 weeks. We're going to take excellent care of both of you." The labor progressed quickly, complicated by Grace's emotional trauma and the physical stress her body had endured over months of abuse. Dr. Whitman arrived to supervise the delivery, her own legal troubles temporarily forgotten in the face of a medical emergency that required all her skills and experience. "I can see the baby's head," Dr. Whitman announced as Grace pushed through another contraction. "One more push, Grace. Your daughter is almost here." A baby Hope Montgomery entered the world at 3:47 a.m., weighing 4 pounds and 6 ounces, her tiny lungs filling with air as she announced her arrival with a surprisingly strong cry. She was small but perfectly formed, her premature birth requiring immediate NICU care, but posing no immediate danger to her long-term health. Grace held her daughter for the first time while tears streamed down her face, overwhelmed by the fierce protective instinct that every mother recognizes the moment she first touches her child. Hope's tiny fingers wrapped around Grace's thumb with surprising strength, and Grace understood in that moment that she would do anything to protect this innocent life from Richard's violence and manipulation. "She's beautiful," Emma whispered, watching the bonding between mother and daughter with tears in her own eyes. "Look at those strong lungs. She's going to be a fighter, just like her mother." The peaceful moment was shattered when Richard Montgomery appeared in the NICU corridor, demanding visitation rights and bringing with him the chaos that seemed to follow everywhere he went. Hospital security had been notified of the restraining order, but Richard's lawyers had argued that the temporary order didn't extend to preventing him from seeing his newborn daughter. "Where is my child, my chun?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing through the normally quiet NICU hallway. "I have every right to see my own daughter." Emma positioned herself between Richard and the NICU entrance, her small frame somehow projecting an authority that made the wealthy developer take a step backward. "Mr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery is recovering from delivery and doesn't want to see you. The baby is in intensive care and has a limited visitation." "Don't you dare tell me I can't see my own daughter," Richard snarled, his carefully controlled public persona beginning to crack under the stress of legal battles and media scrutiny. "I pay more in taxes than you make in a year, and I won't be kept from my child by some nurse with delusions of authority." The confrontation was taking place in full view of other families visiting the NICU, and Emma realized that once again, she was witnessing Richard Montgomery's true character emerging when he faced challenges to his control. Without hesitation, she activated her phone's recording function, capturing his threats and aggressive behavior for the second time. "Mr. Montgomery, you're disturbing other families and creating a hostile environment in a medical facility," Emma said firmly. "I'm documenting this interaction, and I'm prepared to call security if you don't lower your voice and behave appropriately." "Sittity." Richard's face flushed red with rage at the mention of recording, his previous experience with Emma's documentation having already caused him enormous legal and public relations problems. "You recorded me again? This is harassment. I'll sue you personally for invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress." But Emma had learned from their previous encounter, and this time she was prepared for Richard's legal threats. "Mr. Montgomery, you're in a public area of the hospital, threatening staff and disturbing patients. I have every right to document behavior that threatens the safety of people in my care." The second recording captured Richard's pattern of financial intimidation and threats against healthcare workers, providing additional evidence of his character and his unwillingness to modify his behavior even after facing legal consequences for his previous assault on Grace. "You'll never see a dime of my money," Richard hissed, his voice dropping to the menacing whisper that Grace had learned to fear over years of marriage. "I'll make sure you and that ungrateful wife of mine live in poverty. I have lawyers who specialize in destroying people who cross me." The threats were spoken loud enough for other families in the NICU corridor to hear, providing multiple witnesses to Richard's promise of financial abuse and retaliation. Emma continued recording, knowing that this evidence would demonstrate Richard's ongoing pattern of using his wealth as a weapon against anyone who dared to protect his wife. Grace emerged from her recovery room in a wheelchair, drawn by the sound of Richard's raised voice and concerned about the safety of the staff who had protected her. She was weak from the delivery and exhausted from months of stress, but the sight of her husband terrorizing the women who had saved her life filled her with a rage she had never experienced before. "Get away from them, Richard," Grace said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. "These people have done nothing but help me and protect our daughter. You have no right to threaten them." Richard turned to face his wife, and for a moment the corridor fell silent, except for the soft beeping of medical equipment from nearby rooms. Grace sat in her wheelchair, holding baby Hope, who slept peacefully despite the chaos surrounding her birth, and the sight of his daughter seemed to momentarily soften Richard's expression. "Grace, she's beautiful," Richard said, his voice dropping to something approaching normal human emotion. "Let me hold my daughter. I just want to hold her." But Grace had finally found the voice that had been silenced by years of abuse and intimidation. "You'll never hurt us again, Richard. You can see Hope through supervised visitation once the court determines it's safe, but I won't allow you to traumatize our daughter the way you traumatized me." The public rejection in front of witnesses was the final humiliation that Richard's ego couldn't tolerate. His mask of civilization fell away completely as he lunged toward the wheelchair, only to be intercepted by hospital security guards who had been summoned by Emma's emergency alert. "Sir, you need to leave immediately," the lead security guard said, positioning himself between Richard and the women he was threatening. "You're in violation of a restraining order, and you're disturbing patients in a medical facility." As Richard was escorted away by security, his threats echoing down the hospital corridor, Emma stopped her recording and looked at the evidence she had captured. The second recording provided additional proof of Richard's pattern of intimidation and financial abuse, showing that he had learned nothing from his previous legal troubles. Grace looked down at baby Hope, who had slept through the entire confrontation, and made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "I will never let him hurt you," she whispered to her daughter. "We're going to be free, and we're going to be safe." The chapter ended with Richard being served with an expanded restraining order that prohibited any contact with Grace or baby Hope, while Emma's second recording provided prosecutors with additional evidence of his ongoing pattern of threatening behavior and financial abuse. Grace's courage in standing up to her abuser while holding her newborn daughter had inspired everyone present, but it had also escalated the legal battle to a new level of intensity. Richard Montgomery's carefully constructed world was crumbling, but cornered predators are often at their most dangerous, and everyone involved knew that the real fight was just beginning. Jake Sullivan's law office had been transformed into a war room over the past 3 weeks, with evidence boxes stacked against every wall and whiteboards covered in legal strategies designed to ensure Richard Montgomery's conviction. The domestic violence attorney had handled high-profile cases before, but never one with such clear evidence and so many witnesses willing to testify against a wealthy perpetrator. Emma Richardson's 2 recordings formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, providing audio evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could completely dismiss. The first recording captured the assault itself, while the second demonstrated Richard's ongoing pattern of threats and intimidation, even after facing legal consequences. "We have something I've never had in 20 years of domestic violence cases," Sullivan explained to Grace and Maggie during a strategy meeting. "We have real-time audio evidence of the abuse happening, not just testimony about what happened after the fact." But Marcus Sterling's defense team wasn't conceding defeat. They had filed multiple motions challenging the admissibility of the recordings, arguing that Emma Richardson had violated hospital privacy policies and state recording laws by documenting private conversations without proper consent from all parties. Their strongest argument is that the first recording was obtained illegally, Sullivan continued, reviewing the defense motions. They're claiming that Emma had no legal authority to record in a medical facility and that the evidence should be suppressed as fruit of the poisonous tree. Dr. Patricia Whitman had spent countless hours working with the legal team to establish the medical justification for Emma's actions, demonstrating that healthcare workers were mandatory reporters with legal obligations to document suspected domestic violence when patient safety was at risk. "The recording was made during the commission of a crime against a patient in my care," Dr. Whitman testified during a pretrial hearing. Emma Richardson was acting within her professional obligations to document threats against a vulnerable pregnant woman. The judge's ruling on the admissibility of the recordings would determine whether the case proceeded to trial or collapsed under the weight of Richard's legal challenges. Sullivan had prepared alternative strategies, but everyone knew that without the audio evidence, convicting a millionaire husband with unlimited legal resources would be nearly impossible. 3 additional women had come forward with their own stories about Richard Montgomery's abusive behavior, providing crucial pattern evidence that demonstrated his consistent history of violence and intimidation. Maria Santos, who had worked as a housekeeper in the Montgomery home, testified about witnessing Richard's explosive anger and Grace's injuries over the past year. "I saw the bruises," Maria said during her deposition. "Mrs. Grace, she tried to hide them, but I clean house, I see everything. She was scared all the time, jumping when Mr. Richard came home, always apologizing for things that weren't her fault." Jennifer Walsh, who had dated Richard briefly before his marriage to Grace, provided testimony about his pattern of controlling behavior and verbal abuse that had escalated toward physical violence before she ended the relationship. "He started sweet, like they all do," Jennifer explained to Sullivan's paralegal. "But once he thought he had control, the mask came off. He monitored my phone, controlled my finances, and threatened me when I tried to leave. I was lucky to get away before it got physical." The third witness was Rebecca Martinez, a former business partner whose company had been destroyed when she refused Richard's inappropriate advances during contract negotiations. Her testimony established Richard's pattern of using his wealth and power to punish women who defied his control. "Richard Montgomery ruins people who cross him," Rebecca testified. "When I rejected his advances and threatened to report his behavior, he used his connections to destroy my business and blacklist me from the industry. It took me 3 years to rebuild my career." Dr. Whitman faced her own legal battle as Richard's team attempted to destroy her reputation and credibility as a witness. The malpractice suit accused her of conspiring with Emma Richardson to create a hostile environment that provoked Richard's violent reaction. But medical ethics review boards had dismissed the complaints as frivolous litigation designed to intimidate a mandatory reporter. "They're trying to punish me for protecting a patient," Dr. Whitman explained during a television interview that aired statewide. "If healthcare providers are afraid to document domestic violence because wealthy abusers can destroy us with legal threats, then vulnerable women will continue to suffer in silence." Emma Richardson had become a reluctant symbol of courage for healthcare workers across the country, but she was also facing professional review boards and potential loss of her nursing license. The hospital administration had initially distanced themselves from her actions, but public support and legal pressure had forced them to rally behind their staff. "Emma Richardson represents the best of our profession," announced the head of the State Nursing Association. "She risked her career to protect a vulnerable patient, and now she's being punished by a wealthy abuser who wants to silence anyone who exposes his true character." The pretrial publicity had been intense, with women's rights organizations organizing protests outside Richard's business offices and social media campaigns supporting Grace's courage in standing up to her millionaire husband. The case had become a symbol of whether wealth could buy immunity from domestic violence laws. Grace spent hours in therapy preparing to testify against Richard, working through years of trauma bonding and psychological manipulation that had convinced her to protect her abuser. The therapist, Dr. Lisa Chen, specialized in helping domestic violence victims understand the complex psychology of abusive relationships. "Grace, you need to understand that your feelings of guilt and responsibility for Richard's behavior are symptoms of the abuse itself," Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions. "Abusers systematically break down their victims' sense of reality and self-worth to maintain control." The therapy sessions revealed the depth of Richard's financial abuse, showing how he had systematically isolated Grace from friends and family while creating complete financial dependence. Every aspect of her life had been controlled and monitored, from her phone usage to her shopping habits to her medical appointments. "I realize now that I haven't made an independent decision in years," Grace admitted during one session. "Richard convinced me that I was incapable of handling any responsibility, and I believed him because questioning him always led to punishment." Rebecca Montgomery's secret cooperation with the prosecution had provided crucial insider information about Richard's history of violence, including incidents from his college years that had been covered up by family money and influence. The elderly woman's guilt over enabling her son's behavior had finally overcome her loyalty to the family reputation. "I've been protecting Richard from the consequences of his actions for 30 years, Rebecca confided to Sullivan during a private meeting. "I thought I was helping him, but I realize now that I was just enabling him to hurt more women." The financial investigation had revealed Richard's sophisticated methods for controlling and hiding marital assets, using shell companies and offshore accounts to ensure that Grace would have no financial resources if she tried to leave. The forensic accounting showed a pattern of financial abuse that extended back to the beginning of their marriage. Hospital security footage from multiple cameras had corroborated Emma's recordings, showing Richard's aggressive behavior and Grace's fearful responses during both incidents. The video evidence eliminated any possibility that the audio recordings had been taken out of context or manipulated. As the trial date approached, Sullivan felt cautiously optimistic about their chances of conviction, but he also knew that Richard Montgomery's legal team would use every resource at their disposal to attack the evidence and discredit the witnesses. "We have the strongest domestic violence case I've ever prosecuted," Sullivan told Grace during their final pretrial meeting, "but wealthy defendants have advantages that most abusers don't possess. We need to be prepared for a brutal legal battle." The chapter ended with jury selection beginning, media attention reaching fever pitch, and Grace preparing to face her abuser in court while protecting their daughter Hope, who was thriving in the NICU despite her premature birth. The trial would determine not only Richard's fate, but whether justice could prevail against wealth and power in cases of domestic violence. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as the trial of Richard Montgomery began on a crisp Monday morning in October, with reporters, women's rights advocates, and curious citizens filling every available seat to witness what had become a national symbol of the fight against domestic violence among the wealthy elite. Judge Franklin Hayes, a 58-year-old veteran of the family court system, had handled hundreds of domestic violence cases during his career, but he understood that the Montgomery trial would test every aspect of the legal system's ability to hold powerful men accountable for their crimes. Emma Richardson took the witness stand with quiet dignity, her nurse's uniform replaced by a conservative blue suit that emphasized her professional credibility. She had faced months of legal attacks on her character and career, but her resolve to seek justice for Grace and baby Hope had never wavered. "Ms. Richardson," prosecutor Amanda Walsh began, "please tell the court what you witnessed in the examination room on the day in question." Emma's testimony was clear and unwavering as she described the escalating tension in the room, Richard's threatening behavior toward his pregnant wife, and the moment when his anger erupted into physical violence. "I heard the slap from across the room," Emma said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her testimony. Mrs. Montgomery's head snapped to the side, and she immediately put her hand over her belly to protect the baby. "That's when I knew I had to act." The recording played in the courtroom with crystal clarity, the sound of Richard's hand striking Grace causing audible gasps from the gallery. Richard's threats against the medical staff echoed through the speakers, his voice cold and menacing as he promised to destroy anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Marcus Sterling's cross-examination of Emma was brutal but ineffective, his attempts to portray her as a vindictive employee seeking attention falling flat against her professional demeanor and obvious sincerity. "Ms. Richardson, isn't it true that you recorded my client without his consent, violating hospital privacy policies?" Sterling demanded, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "Mr. Sterling, I documented a crime being committed against a patient in my care," Emma replied calmly. "My professional obligations as a mandatory reporter required me to protect Mrs. Montgomery and preserve evidence of the assault." Dr. Patricia Whitman's testimony provided crucial medical context for Grace's injuries, presenting the pattern of abuse that had been carefully documented over months of appointments. The physician's credibility was unshakable, her decades of experience lending weight to every word she spoke. "In my professional opinion, Mrs. Montgomery was the victim of systematic domestic violence that escalated throughout her pregnancy," Dr. Whitman testified. "The injuries I documented were consistent with intentional assault, not accidents or clumsiness, as she initially claimed." Grace took the witness stand on the trial's third day, her appearance dramatically different from the frightened woman who had cowered in the examination room months earlier. Motherhood and the support of women who believed in her had given her a strength that radiated throughout the courtroom. "Mrs. Montgomery," prosecutor Walsh said gently, "please tell the court about your marriage to the defendant." Grace's testimony was devastating in its quiet honesty, describing years of escalating control and abuse that had been hidden behind Richard's public persona as a successful businessman and devoted husband. She spoke of financial manipulation, social isolation, and the constant fear that had dominated every aspect of her daily life. Richard controlled everything, Grace said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Our bank accounts, my credit cards, even my phone calls were monitored. He convinced me that I was incompetent and helpless, that I needed him to make every decision for me. The courtroom was silent as Grace described the progression from verbal abuse to physical violence. The way Richard's need for control had intensified as her pregnancy advanced and she began to assert small measures of independence. The morning of the incident, I had asked Dr. Whitman about prenatal classes, Grace continued. Richard was furious that I had made plans without asking his permission first. He said I was embarrassing him by acting like a typical pregnant woman who couldn't control her emotions. Sterling's cross-examination of Grace was a masterclass in victim blaming, attempting to portray her as an unstable gold digger who had fabricated abuse allegations to gain financial advantage in a divorce proceeding. Mrs. Montgomery, isn't it true that you married my client for his money? Sterling asked, his tone dripping with disdain. And isn't it convenient that these abuse allegations surfaced just as you were considering divorce proceedings? Grace's response revealed the transformation that motherhood and support had created in her character. Mr. Sterling, I married Richard because I loved him and believed his promises that he would cherish and protect me. The abuse began gradually, and I stayed because he convinced me that I deserved it and that no one else would ever want me. The testimony from other victims provided crucial pattern evidence that established Richard's consistent history of abusive behavior across multiple relationships and situations. Maria Santos, Jennifer Walsh, and Rebecca Martinez painted a picture of a man who used wealth and power to control and punish women who defied him. Richard Montgomery took the witness stand in his own defense, his arrogance and sense of entitlement immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom. His expensive suit and confident demeanor couldn't disguise the cold calculation behind his eyes as he attempted to justify his behavior. My wife was having an emotional breakdown, Richard testified, his voice carrying the same condescending tone he had used to dismiss Grace's concerns for years. Pregnancy hormones had made her irrational and prone to hysteria. I was trying to calm her down when she became violent, and I had to defend myself. The lies were so brazen and easily contradicted by the audio evidence that even Sterling seemed uncomfortable with his client's testimony. Richard's claim that Grace had attacked him first was immediately disproven by the recording, which clearly captured the sound of his hand striking her face. Prosecutor Walsh's cross-examination exposed Richard's true character, his narcissistic rage emerging as she challenged his version of events with documented evidence and witness testimony. Mr. Montgomery, the recording clearly captures you striking your wife, Walsh said, playing the audio again for the jury. How do you explain that sound if you were supposedly defending yourself? Richard's composure cracked completely as he was confronted with undeniable proof of his guilt. She needed discipline, he snarled, his mask of civilization falling away to reveal the abuser beneath. Grace was out of control, making me look bad in front of medical professionals. Someone had to put her in her place. The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom, providing exactly the evidence that prosecutors needed to prove Richard's intent and his complete lack of remorse for assaulting his pregnant wife. Sterling's closing argument attempted to portray Richard as a victim of a conspiracy involving vengeful medical professionals and a manipulative wife, but the evidence was too overwhelming for even his skilled rhetoric to overcome. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is a successful businessman who has been systematically destroyed by people who resented his wealth and position, Sterling argued. The recording was obtained illegally. The witnesses have financial motives to lie, and my client's wife has used this unfortunate incident to extort millions of dollars from him. Prosecutor Walsh's closing argument focused on the clear evidence of domestic violence and the importance of holding wealthy abusers accountable for their crimes, regardless of their financial resources or social connections. Richard Montgomery believes that his money makes him above the law, Walsh told the jury. He believes that he can assault his pregnant wife, threaten the medical professionals who tried to protect her, and then buy his way out of the consequences. Your verdict will determine whether justice applies equally to everyone or whether wealth can purchase immunity from domestic violence laws. The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, their swift decision reflecting the overwhelming evidence against Richard Montgomery. The foreman stood to deliver a verdict that would change multiple lives forever. On the charge of assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of intimidating a witness, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of making terroristic threats, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as Richard Montgomery was led away in handcuffs, his wealth and influence finally unable to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Grace wept with relief. Emma smiled with satisfaction, and Dr. Whitman felt vindicated in her decision to protect a vulnerable patient. Judge Hayes sentenced Richard to 2 years in prison plus 5 years of supervised probation with mandatory anger management and domestic violence counseling. The civil damages awarded to Grace totaled $15 million, providing financial security for her and baby Hope, while sending a clear message about the cost of domestic violence. Emma Richardson received a commendation from the State Nursing Board for her courage in documenting the assault, and the hospital implemented new protocols for healthcare workers to safely report and document suspected domestic violence. The Emma Protocol became a model for medical facilities across the country. Dr. Whitman's malpractice suits were dismissed with prejudice, and she became a national advocate for mandatory reporting requirements in medical professionals' role in identifying and preventing domestic violence among wealthy patients who were traditionally protected by their resources and social status. The chapter ended with Richard Montgomery beginning his prison sentence, while his business empire collapsed under the weight of scandal and boycotts. Grace rebuilding her life with financial independence and the support of women who had found their own courage through her example, and Emma continuing her nursing career with the knowledge that her actions had saved lives and changed laws. 6 months after the trial's conclusion, Grace Montgomery stood in the nursery of her new townhouse, watching baby Hope sleep peacefully in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows that Richard would never again darken with his presence. At 8 months old, Hope was thriving, her premature birth just a memory as she grew stronger and more beautiful each day. The townhouse was modest compared to the mansion Grace had shared with Richard, but every corner represented freedom and safety in ways that no amount of luxury could match. She had chosen the location carefully, in a quiet neighborhood where she could raise her daughter without the constant fear that had dominated her previous life. Grace's transformation over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The frightened, isolated woman who had cowered in Dr. Whitman's examination room had been replaced by a confident advocate for domestic violence victims, her own experience giving her the credibility and passion needed to create real change. The Grace Montgomery Foundation for Domestic Violence Prevention had been established with a portion of her civil settlement money, focusing specifically on helping pregnant women escape abusive relationships. The foundation provided emergency housing, legal assistance, and financial support for women who found themselves trapped by wealthy abusers. Emma Richardson had accepted the position of program coordinator for the foundation, using her medical background and firsthand experience with the legal system to develop protocols that other healthcare workers could follow when encountering domestic violence. Her work had already saved dozens of women from situations similar to Grace's. The most important thing we've learned, Emma explained during a television interview about the foundation's work, is that domestic violence crosses all social and economic boundaries. Wealthy abusers are often more dangerous because they have resources to control, manipulate, and silence their victims in ways that other abusers cannot. Dr. Patricia Whitman had become a national spokesperson for medical professionals' role in identifying and preventing domestic violence, testifying before Congress about the need for better training and legal protection for healthcare workers who report suspected abuse. The Grace Montgomery case showed us that mandatory reporting requirements mean nothing if medical professionals are afraid to act, Dr. Whitman told a Senate subcommittee. We need legal protections for healthcare workers who document domestic violence, and we need standardized protocols that all medical facilities can implement. The congressional testimony led to new federal legislation requiring hospitals to develop domestic violence screening and documentation protocols, with legal protections for medical professionals who report suspected abuse. The HOPE Act was named after Grace's daughter, symbolizing the new life and possibilities that could emerge from the darkest circumstances. Richard Montgomery's appeal had been unsuccessful, his legal team unable to overcome the overwhelming evidence of his guilt or convince appellate judges that his wealth entitled him to special treatment. He remained in prison, his business empire divided among creditors, and his reputation permanently destroyed by his own recorded words. Rebecca Montgomery had surprised everyone by becoming one of Grace's strongest supporters. Her guilt over enabling Richard's behavior for so many years, driving her to make amends through action rather than words. She had established a trust fund for Hope that Richard could never access, ensuring her granddaughter's financial security regardless of any future legal challenges. "I spent 30 years protecting Richard from the consequences of his choices," Rebecca admitted during a private meeting with Grace. "I thought I was being a good mother, but I realize now that I was just enabling him to hurt more women. I can't undo the past, but I can try to secure Hope's future." The relationship between Grace and Rebecca remained complicated, but both women understood that Hope deserved to have a grandmother who was committed to protecting her rather than enabling abusive behavior. Maria Santos, the housekeeper who had testified about witnessing Richard's abuse, had received a settlement from the Montgomery estate and used the money to start her own cleaning service, employing other immigrant women who had experienced domestic violence. Her business had become a symbol of how victims could transform their experiences into sources of strength and community support. The viral recording that had exposed Richard's true character continued to serve as a powerful educational tool, played in domestic violence training sessions and legal advocacy programs across the country. The clear audio of a millionaire husband assaulting his pregnant wife had shattered many people's assumptions about who domestic violence victims were and where abuse occurred. Grace's decision to refuse Rebecca's $25 million settlement offer had been vindicated by the Civil Damages Award and her foundation's impact, proving that choosing justice over silence could create lasting change that benefited countless other victims. The foundation's emergency shelter program had housed over 200 women and children in its first 6 months, providing not just temporary safety, but comprehensive services including legal representation, job training, and psychological counseling designed to help victims rebuild their lives with genuine independence. Emma's work developing the medical protocols had been adopted by hospitals in 15 states, creating standardized procedures for healthcare workers to safely document suspected domestic violence and connect victims with appropriate resources. The protocols included legal protections for medical professionals and clear guidelines for when recording evidence was appropriate and necessary. 1 year after baby Hope's dramatic birth in the NICU, Grace returned to the same hospital for Hope's pediatric checkup, walking through corridors that had once been the site of her husband's violent outburst, but now represented triumph and transformation. Emma Richardson, now wearing the badge of Patient Advocacy Director, greeted them warmly in the same examination room where she had first stood up to Richard Montgomery. The room had been redesigned as a family-friendly space, with comfortable seating and educational materials about domestic violence resources prominently displayed. "How are my two favorite fighters?" Emma asked, lifting Hope into her arms as the toddler giggled and reached for her face. Grace smiled, looking around the room where her new life had really begun. "We're home, Emma. For the first time in years, we're really home." The examination proceeded smoothly, Hope's health excellent and her development ahead of schedule despite her premature birth. Dr. Whitman joined them for the final consultation, her own transformation from cautious physician to national advocate evident in her confident demeanor and passionate commitment to protecting vulnerable patients. "Hope is thriving," Dr. Whitman announced, reviewing the examination results. "She's strong, healthy, and shows no lasting effects from her early arrival. She's going to be just fine." Grace held her daughter close, understanding that Dr. Whitman's words applied to more than just Hope's physical health. They had all survived Richard Montgomery's attempt to destroy them, and they had emerged stronger, more determined, and committed to ensuring that other women would have the support and protection that Grace had found in her darkest hour. The foundation's work continued to expand, reaching women in situations that mirrored Grace's own experience, trapped by wealthy abusers who used their resources to maintain control and silence victims. Each success story validated Grace's decision to fight rather than flee, to choose justice over financial security. Emma's protocols had prevented numerous domestic violence incidents by training healthcare workers to recognize warning signs and intervene before situations escalated to physical violence. The early intervention strategies developed through the foundation had saved marriages that could be healed and helped women escape relationships that could not be reformed. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Grace paused in the corridor where Richard had threatened Emma and Dr. Whitman after Hope's birth. The memory of that confrontation seemed distant now, like something that had happened to different people in a different lifetime. "Do you ever regret recording him?" Grace asked Emma as they walked toward the parking garage. Emma considered the question seriously, thinking about the months of legal challenges, professional attacks, and personal threats she had endured as a consequence of her decision to document Richard's assault. "Never," Emma replied firmly. "That recording saved your life and Hope's future. It exposed a dangerous man who had been hurting women for years and would have continued hurting them if someone hadn't stood up to him. I'd make the same choice again tomorrow." Grace's final stop was at the Foundation's offices, where she spent several hours each week counseling newly arrived residents and helping them navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of escaping domestic violence. Her own experience gave her credibility that no amount of professional training could match. The woman she met with that afternoon was 32 years old, 7 months pregnant, and bearing the familiar marks of systematic abuse by a wealthy husband who controlled every aspect of her life. The parallels to Grace's own story were striking, but this woman would have resources and support that Grace had been forced to find on her own. "I don't know if I can do this," the woman whispered, her hand protectively covering her pregnant belly in a gesture that Grace recognized immediately. "He says no one will believe me, that his lawyers will destroy anyone who tries to help me." Grace reached across the desk to take the woman's hand, offering the strength and hope that Emma Richardson and Dr. Whitman had once given her during her darkest moments. "I thought the same thing," Grace said quietly. "I believed that his money and power made him untouchable, that fighting back would only make things worse. But I was wrong. Justice is possible, even against wealthy abusers, but only if we're brave enough to demand it and support each other through the fight." The conversation continued for over an hour, Grace sharing the practical details of legal strategy while also providing the emotional support that could only come from someone who had survived the same nightmare and emerged victorious. As the sun set over the city, Grace drove home to her townhouse where Hope was waiting with the babysitter, her daughter's laughter filling rooms that had never known fear or violence. The simple evening routine of dinner, bath time, and bedtime stories represented everything that Grace had fought to achieve. A normal life lived in safety and freedom. That night, after Hope was asleep, Grace stood in her daughter's nursery and made the same promise she had made in the NICU corridor when Richard had threatened them for the last time. "I will never let anyone hurt you," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. "We're safe now, and we're free, and we're going to spend the rest of our lives helping other women find their own freedom." The story ended where it had begun, with Grace as a mother protecting her child, but this time from a position of strength rather than fear, surrounded by allies rather than isolated by an abuser, and committed to ensuring that the recording that had saved her life would continue to save others for years to come. Hope slept peacefully, unaware that her mother's courage had changed laws, saved lives, and proven that justice could prevail against even the wealthiest and most powerful domestic abusers. The millionaire husband who had once terrorized them was now just a cautionary tale, while the women he had tried to destroy had become symbols of hope and transformation for countless others facing similar darkness. The recording that Emma Richardson had made in a moment of professional courage continued to echo through courtrooms, training sessions, and advocacy programs across the country. Its clear documentation of domestic violence serving as irrefutable proof that abuse could be stopped, abusers could be held accountable, and victims could not only survive but thrive. Grace Montgomery had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose through the darkest period of her life, emerging as a leader who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that no woman would have to face domestic violence alone or in silence. The Foundation's work would continue for decades, each success story adding to the legacy of courage that had begun with a nurse's decision to press record and a mother's decision to fight for justice instead of accepting blood money. The transformation was complete. From victim to survivor to advocate to leader, Grace had traveled a journey that seemed impossible during those terrifying months when Richard's wealth and influence had seemed insurmountable. But justice had prevailed, love had conquered fear, and hope had emerged from the darkest circumstances to light the way forward for countless other women who would benefit from Grace's courage for generations to come. Grace Montgomery's story proves that courage is contagious. One person's bravery can spark a movement that saves countless lives. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to the reality of domestic violence among the wealthy, I need your help sharing it with others who might need to hear Grace's message of hope. Hit that like button if you believe justice should never depend on the size of someone's bank account. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Did this story change how you view domestic violence or the power of speaking up? Your words might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because stories like Grace's need to be told, shared, and remembered. When we subscribe to channels that amplify survivors' voices, we're not just following content, we're joining a community that refuses to let wealth silence truth. Share this with someone who believes in justice, someone who works in healthcare, or someone who simply needs to hear that escape is possible, even from the most powerful abusers. Together, we can make sure Grace's courage continues to echo and inspire long after her story ends. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of a community that believes every voice matters, regardless of how much money someone has to try to silence it.